Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. This is our monthly Contrarian episode with a roundtable drawn from the deep bench of that new media undertaking. And it comes at a natural inflection point in our living national drama. Last week brought a spate of retrospectives on Trump's first 100 days. On one side of the ledger, Trump 2.0 has inflicted historic, perhaps irreversible damage, warping the executive branch and reshaping civil society in deeply destabilizing and undemocratic ways. On the other side, a surprisingly hollow record for the maximum leader, virtually no new legislation, a fusillade of executive orders, many stalled or likely to be invalidated by the courts, and a free fall in approval ratings that threatens to derail or at least stall his authoritarian momentum. Now, entering our second 100 days of Trump 2.0, Trump's overreach continues. But it's increasingly being met by serious resistance in the courts, among Democrats in Congress, and, most critically, from the American people. This week, a Trump-appointed district court judge in South Texas issued the first opinion on the merits of the administration's deportation program, resoundingly striking it down as unlawful. And Trump took it on the chin in several other cases. Most notably, in a tour de force released after we taped, Judge Beryl Howe of the D.C. District Court demolished the administration's effort to target law firms based on past work for Democrats. But while the federal courts continue to hold the line on judicial review, the administration keeps sending mixed and troubling signals on whether it will acquiesce when push comes to shove, or will instead plunge the country into paralyzing chaos. To unpack these critical and complicated developments, we welcome three members of the Contrarians' formidable brain trust. And they are Ambassador, retired, Norm Eisen, the founder and executive chair of the State Democracy Defenders Fund, sort of the hardest working man in the commentariat going all around courts in the country. But it's been instrumental in the legal pushback against the tyrannical moves of the Trump administration. But he is also a heavy lifter in the court of public opinion as the co-founder and publisher of The Contrarian, an effort that all four of us in today's podcast have joined. Welcome, as always, Ambassador Eisen.
Thank you, Harry. They used to say about James Brown, the hardest working man in showbiz.
He had 4 sobriquets. Can anybody name them? Hardest working man in show business, Godfather of Soul, Soul Brother #1, and I'll get back to it. Jen Rubin, Bold 86, is the editor-in-chief and co-founder of The Contrarian. Before launching that effort with Norm, she spent over 14 years as an opinion columnist at the Washington Post, shaking them to their boots when she left summarily. She's the author of the book Resistance: How Women Saved Democracy from Donald Trump. I hope a sequel is in the offing there. Jen Rubin, thanks for joining.
Oh, it is a pleasure. And Harry and I always have a good time reminiscing about our time at Bolt Hall. And he, of course, also left a paper shaking in his boots. It was strictly downhill for the Los Angeles Times after Harry decamped, also on principle. So we have 3 quitters here.
Yeah, that's right. Impactful resigners. I'm sure Steve will come up with something to resign from, but so far he just keeps getting more offers, including most recently to come up from Texas to Georgetown. But Steve is a contributor for The Contrarian, professor at Georgetown University Law Center in his first year, the Supreme Court analyst for CNN, and co-host of the really excellent National Security Law podcast. His book, entitled The Shadow Docket: How the Supreme Court Uses Stealth Rulings to Amass Power and Undermine the Republic, was a New York Times bestseller, and his, for my money, indispensable Substack, and I don't say that lightly, is titled One First. Steve, thanks for being here.
Thank you. And I think, Harry, the James Brown nickname I've always liked the most is Mr. Dynamite.
All right. We have our first ruling on the merits of the administration's Alien Enemies Act cases. And this ruling, by the way, underlies everyone's deportation, not just the people who claim they're not members of Tren de Aragua. A federal judge in Texas, a Trump appointee, Fernando Rodriguez Jr., said that the verkacht interpretation that has the ragtag people in the United States as a predatory invasion by a foreign country just doesn't hold water. So let's just start. How big a blow for the Trump administration was the holding out of the Southern District?
I want Steve to tell us how quickly the Fifth Circuit is going to screw this up.
Well, that's the question, right?
I mean, I think both things are true. So I think it's a really significant ruling. Judge Rodriguez is not the first judge to suggest some of this. Judge Gallagher had already gotten much of the way there in the Colorado case. But, this was a permanent injunction. So this is the first conclusive ruling to that effect. Jen's exactly right. The whole reason why this went to the Supreme Court the first time, back in April 7th, which feels like a year ago, is because the Trump administration was trying desperately to get these cases into the Fifth Circuit. And now they are. So I think this is a meaningful development, Harry. I think it's a good reminder that all of the fighting about how much process is due in Alien Enemy Act cases is kind of the secondary question and one that can be mooted by sort of just dealing with the top level question. But I'm with Jen. I mean, I am not betting a long over on when the Fifth Circuit reverses, at which point, this goes back to the Supreme Court, which frankly is where it should have been starting on April 7th.
Well, and maybe they hold because by then we may have a ruling from the Second Circuit. It looks like Hellerstein in the district court will rule quickly, possibly the 10th, as you say, because of Colorado. It'll be hard for them to duck.
I think whichever circuit goes first gets there first. I mean, whether it's the 5th, the 2nd, or the 10th, a circuit is going to rule on the merits. And then either they're going to rule against the Trump administration and it's the government asking the Supreme Court to step in, or they're going to rule for the Trump administration and now it's the detainees. And I think either of those gets the justice's attention.
Let's spend a minute on the substance here. This will come as a shock to some, but there is no Venezuelan invasion of the United States of America. That is not an irrelevant point. Even in the Fifth Circuit, they may question. I have not seen the Venezuelan tanks running through the streets.
Downtown New Orleans.
Yeah, so there may be a few Venezuelans with Mardi Gras beads. There is an invasion of partiers, but there is no AEA invasion, and nor are the other categories really triggered. And that is not irrelevant here. We'll see what the Fifth Circuit does. Judge Rodriguez is no flaming liberal.
Trump appointee.
I was totting up the number of cases that I've filed or worked on or touched or represented people. It's over 60 at this point. I have been surprised at the degree to which judges are applying genuine scrutiny to the Trump administration's BS, including at the Supreme Court. And so, this is Trump's stupidity. Thank God he doesn't know how to do dictatorship.
Norm is right. This was always going to die on the hill of any meaningful judicial review, which is why the first round of cases was the Trump administration resisting judicial review. I will say I'm a half step less, sanguine than Norm. Not because I think the Fifth Circuit's going to say, yes, we're being invaded by Venezuela, but because I don't trust the Fifth Circuit to follow Norm, the other judges who have been rightly skeptical of all of these assertions of...
Fifth Circuit's tough.
And so, I worry less about a Fifth Circuit decision that says, yes, we're being invaded, than I worry about a Fifth Circuit decision saying the president has determined that we're under invasion, and that determination is entitled to a whole lot of deference, if not, right? Again, that won't survive in the Supreme Court. We've already seen the justices try to put a thumb on the scale in that direction, but that's why I'm not quite as sort of sure that that's how this ends.
I think there are three things that have stood out to me. One is the degree to which these judges have brushed aside the national security excuse, whether it's state secrets, whether it's political question, in whatever guise. I think the first Trump administration got away with a lot on that guise. And they not unsurprisingly felt that that was a great argument to escape any kind of judicial review. After all, that's what finally prevailed after they revised the Muslim ban. And courts generally are deferential towards national security. But in this case, they have pushed the envelope a little bit too far. The second that is surprising, of course, is the degree to which not only the administration, Trump in particular, has ignored court rulings, but the contemptuous tone, the rudeness, the snideness. What logical kind of strategy is that to offend, so many judges throughout
the double speak, right? Yeah,
exactly. And the last thing, the issue that I'm less optimistic about, and tragically so, is getting the people back from El Salvador. I think there's a very good chance that the court will require an individualized attention. But what do we do about the people that are there? And what kind of due process would be set up for them there? And how long can the administration monkey around with the facilitate return issue? And we have since learned, of course, that many of the people there have scant, if not no, evidence of ties to this Venezuelan gang. And that remains a huge injustice and stain, really, on the United States.
Man, it is a huge problem, even for a straight up administration or court. I just want to double back because this is off script, but Steve, you scare me now because I had just assumed that when the other cases come up, including the Second Circuit and probably the 10th, they would be consolidated. I have to imagine they'll be decided in advance of the Supreme Court's actually taking, even if the Fifth Circuit rules first. So I do see the real possibility that the administration will give just enough for some court to say, well, okay, you facilitated, too bad for everyone else. But if it really comes up from just the Fifth Circuit, then in a way, it's actually kind of a bad thing that Rodriguez ruled first.
So I guess the two things I would say is, one, let's separate the sort of the getting them back category of cases from the keeping them from getting removed category of cases. And in the latter, what makes me a little nervous, Harry, is not that the Supreme Court will do the right thing at the end of the day. It's that Judge Rodriguez's order covers a different group of detainees than the Supreme Court's late Friday night, early Saturday morning intervention.
Yes.
And
Good
so,
point.
If the Fifth Circuit comes along and says, oh, we're staying Judge Rodriguez's permanent injunction, then this goes back to the Supreme Court really quickly in a context and a posture in which I worry about the Trump administration trying to do some mischief before the justices are in a position to rule. Again, I'm not worried about how it ends. I'm worried about the opportunities for mischief along the way. For the cases of the guys who are already in Venezuela, this is why I think one of the most important developments didn't get a lot of attention the last week was the ACLU amending its lawsuit, right? The original, the OG.
Back to Boasberg now, right? Yeah.
Back to Boasberg. Yep. Because that is, to me, how you do this, right? Is you get class certification of everyone who was removed under the AEA, right, to the CICOT, and then you have one case to cover them.
And the administration, I don't know if you saw, came in last night with a very aggressive brief to him, arguing the very AEA interpretation that Rodriguez has rejected.
Just remember one point, Harry. Part of the DC case, the administration says that some of those deportees were not subject to AEA, but other authorities, just adding to the procedural thicket. So, and I'll put one other layer in. There's the question of the deportees who are gone and getting them back. There's the question of the supposed largest deportation ever, which so far hasn't happened. And these cases really have slowed the administration down. They haven't chosen to engage in wholesale disregard of the rulings that would signal the highest DEFCON of constitutional crisis. There's a third level of activity that's going on here, and that is the rule of law chessboard. My heart breaks for Kilmar Abrego Garcia and his family and his fate. I'm concerned that the administration will say we did everything we could to facilitate the latest catastrophic Trump interview. Where would I be in all my dozens of cases without Trump's admissions on social media and elsewhere? Whatever the determination is as to Kilmar, and indeed as to these 200 people who are illegally abducted to El Salvador, the Supreme Court is also looking at a president that is running amok. They unleashed him with their odious, historically bad immunity decision. They must be looking, some of them, with rue at who let the dogs out. Supreme Court let the dog out. And they're calibrating. I think when you look at that 7-2 decision on facilitate versus effectuate, they're trying to do a Goldilocks thing of getting just the right amount of pressure. And that's the larger, it's such an extraordinary moment in the history of checks and balances of these three. It's like the agonizing, the famous debates between Frankfurter and Warren over Brown v. Board and how far to go, or the stitch in time that saved 9. This is one of those historic moments where the Supreme Court is asking, how much political juice do we have? That's the third level of the three-dimensional chess.
All great points. And I just want to add one thing. If the holding by Rodriguez, stays, it's not a matter anymore as it has been with Abrego Garcia, et cetera. This guy hasn't gotten any process. It's rather they are down there unlawfully. There was never any basis, even for the nastiest customer, to be down there. And what a incredibly difficult constitutional moment that is.
At the time he wrote the opinion, I was very critical of Roberts because I thought he was so deferential, so obsequious to the chief executive. And it was almost as if he was apologizing for doing his job. And I think Trump's subsequent behavior bore that out. He gave him much too much running room. And now I think the question is whether Roberts is finally going to do his effing job, which is to definitively check the president of the United States. He's been worried about this titanic clash and where he says, Mr. President, you must do X, and Trump doesn't do Y. He's created a much worse problem, which is by giving Trump enough room to wiggle that he's made a mockery of the court. And I think we are seeing now from lower court judges who are considering contempt proceedings. That's the other thing we haven't talked about. How many times in our lifetime have there been multiple contempt proceedings against the federal government in these cases that the lower court judges are much less inclined, perhaps they have to be because they have to control those courtrooms and they see these guys coming and going, about this deflection, word picking, evasion, playing dumb routine. And, I think we saw it even up at the Fourth Circuit when we had Harvey Wilkerson. And the question is, how much longer is the Supreme Court going to give Trump this running room where the lower courts really are to the point where they're done with this game?
I think the answer is a little while longer. And I think some of that's because the court itself, I think, doesn't want to be seen as provoking conflict with the Trump administration in a way that would be more obvious from coming from the Supreme Court than from Harvey Wilkinson. But also, Jen, I think the other problem that John Roberts has is he doesn't want the Trump administration to lose these cases 5-4. He wants the Trump administration to lose these cases 9-0. And it is remarkable that the late Friday night, early Saturday morning ruling was 7-2, right? That we don't know that for sure. It's possible that there were stealth dissents, but, to all appearances, Gorsuch and Kavanaugh both joined Roberts and Barrett and the three Democratic appointees. I think from Roberts' perspective, it is better for the court, and maybe even it's better for the country, if bad behavior by the government actually makes it easier for him to build broader majorities if and when the court is ruling against the administration in these cases. But the court is going to keep giving Trump little victories along the way, and maybe even some big victories. I mean, I for one, am very worried about the fact that they're holding oral argument in the birthright citizenship applications, not because I think they're going to uphold the policy, but because I'm worried that they're going to do this sort of procedural dance with, letting the injunctions go into effect against the non-plaintiffs.
And that procedural dance is the chess game where and it's tragic for the humans who are involved and their families.
Yep.
And for all of us. But that is the chess game. And, look at how long the liberals or the majority let Jim Crow endure and what a baby step Brown v. Board was.
What is also, I think, shocking is that we have been having this discussion for, 20, 25 minutes. None of us have mentioned the Congress of the United States,
Who are
which
they?
is AWOL from all of these. And if people say there's a constitutional crisis, and I've written about it now and given multiple speeches that I don't like that phrase, and yes, we are in one, it's because the Congress isn't doing its effing job. And they have ceded all of this running room, whether it's immigration, whether it's tariffs, whether it's the power of the purse, as Norm knows all too well in his litigation on the gargantuan overreach of the executive, that the court is playing alone. There's no third branch. It's really kind of taking itself out of the equation.
A friendly amendment. We have seen the House appear in amicus form.
I'm talking about the majority.
Yeah, the majority, forget about it. They're the captive of a death cult.
Yes, there is no institutional representation of the Congress by the party that controls the Congress.
The representation is that they occasionally send letters saying, can you violate the Constitution more and faster? But I will say, in fairness, there has been an evolution, and it's been fascinating to track the past 100 days. And we've done it on the Contrarian, because I think the autocratic shock of January 20th stunned many, including the patriotic opposition in Congress. And what we have seen is the minority finding ways. They have found their footing, and there's been an evolution. First, they started filing amicus briefs in the immigration-related cases. For example, there's one in Birthright. I'm litigating Birthright. Over 200 members of the caucus saying, no, Donald Trump can't choose which babies born here are and are not citizens. It's immigration-related. And there's been a series of those. They've been increasingly vocal. But then, when I went to court over the elections EO, which was a part of this theme, all of these cases are Donald Trump driving his theme of, every dictator needs a scapegoat, right? The House and the Senate had standing to challenge that elections EO, which was about putting the federal citizenship on the federal form. So all of these are connected. Birthright, the illegal abductions, the elections EO, they're all about scapegoating. That's Stephen Miller's evil genius. Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries had a table of lawyers next to us fighting that elections EO, not as an amicus, as a party. So I think you're seeing the minority really finding their footing, and that's what we need. And the amazing thing is, however it happened, Donald Trump has gone underwater. He's flipped upside down on the immigration issue. That's extraordinary politically, and that is another dimension, all of this. He's losing, I think, because he lost in courts, because they admitted a mistake with Kilmar. There's other mistakes. The American people don't like that, and they don't like his contemptuousness towards court orders. 80% of Americans say he should follow court orders.
NPR says 85, yeah. First, I want to state a couple corollaries to what people are saying, because I agree with it. The first is we're so right about the Congress, but it's always been a razor's edge, and you could see one of two forces that would nudge things along, because it only needs a little. One is particular issues where he's so unpopular and individual, vulnerable senators or members of Congress, it wouldn't take much to just sort of get a little bit of daylight there. And then second, the court itself, where Norm, among others, is now teeing up this broader issue of like, you are doing nothing but weeding in Congress's garden. If the court makes that clear, that puts Congress in the fix. The only other thing I wanted to mention is I think it could well happen. It's corollary of what Steve said, that we're already geared up. The Supreme Court takes the case. It's the big case. We wait for it, and it comes down in a kind of a fair, procedural, or gentle push because they're trying to keep room. And that's just something to measure, temper expectations about.
We've already seen evidence of it this week, and it is so fascinating. They do not have the votes in Congress among the Republicans to rubber stamp even a fraction of the DOJ cuts. They can't even get that. And that tells me two things. One, this is why Trump had to do it in an unconstitutional manner, because there isn't really support, even in his pathetic, docile party for these kinds of cuts. And secondly, that these people read polls too, that they are inching away. And the other thing they didn't get done was make really any progress on their budget talks. And that is also really remarkable. Now, I will have a piece next week on their concerns. So it will be interesting to see how long these concerns hold up. But you had multiple senators saying, we're not going to go along with these cuts. And now you have multiple House members saying, even a small fraction of the DOJ cuts, we're not going to go along. So it's nothing like falling 20 points in 100 days to get the Congress a little bit back in the game.
A couple senators are scared of Ed Martin. I think a consensus has maybe emerged that notwithstanding the huge wrecking ball damage Trump has done, he really has a pretty poor record of his own to show for it, and that's only reinforced by plunging polls. I wanted to try to look forward a little bit. Let's start with the court. So, Steve, if I can pick on you first, what's the sort of big issue you're nervous about to the extent you sort of look to the future?
Mine is more sort of a holistic question, which is how long can the courts keep this up? This has been an unprecedented number of lawsuits. These are high stress, frantic briefing, quick timeline lawsuits. And there's no reason to think that, for lack of a better word, chaotic energy of the first 100 days of the Trump administration is going to become less chaotic. I mean, as we're sitting here recording, the Trump administration just filed its 13th emergency application in the Supreme Court. Just for context, during the entire Bush and Obama administration, so across 16 years, the federal government sought that kind of relief from the Supreme Court a total of 8 times in 16 years. And, Harry, I have sort of a capacity concern, which is, as Trump keeps doing illegal stuff, I have all the faith in the world in judges of every ideological stripe to do the best they can to do their job. But there are only so many judges, and there are only so many appellate courts, and there are only so many Supreme Court justices. And I worry about what's going to get missed. I mean, there's a sort of a throw everything at the wall phenomenon here, where I think the courts are very capable of fighting a rearguard action, but I'm not so sure how much they can be the front lines. And that's what I worry about in the next 100 days.
They're sort of not designed for that role, right?
They're going to tire out. They don't have any choice. The cases land on them. But what is interesting is a parallel question, which is the Justice Department going to run out of lawyers to take these cases? A whole bunch of them are leaving, and others cannot bring themselves to make these arguments. You guys know better than anyone. It's the telltale sign when you go into some federal court in Texas or Colorado, and the U.S. attorney is not there. There's someone from Maine Justice. And that's because they can't find anybody in that office willing to flush their reputation down the toilet. So when you go through these offices one by one by one, and now we, at least on the civil side, we've seen at the Justice Department, an exodus of people. And look what happened at the Southern District, an exodus of people.
Civil rights. Harmit Dillon was crowing that 100 plus have left, right?
Exactly. So, yes, they will hire more attorneys, but question, who wants to go work for U.S. attorneys' offices? Secondly, if the good people, the experienced people are gone, are you going to be left with a bunch of people who really cannot find the men's room and ladies' room in the courthouse? And third of all, there is a capacity issue as they keep throwing this crap out onto the judicial system.
All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. In today's spirited debate, we unpeel the truth about Pinot Noirs to see where the grapes shine best, Willamette Valley in Oregon or Burgundy, France. Here in the U.S., we classify our New World wines by the grape. Old World wines, like those in Europe, are classified by the region. In France, Burgundy is not only the region where Pinot Noir wines are from, but it's also the Pinot's ancestral home. No pressure, Oregon. To level set, Pinot Noir is a thin-skinned grape, which makes it difficult to grow, especially in warmer climates. Burgundy happens to have a cooler climate with ample cloud cover, making it the perfect home for Pinots. The cooler temperature allows the wines to ripen longer, giving the grapes extra time to develop more complex flavors like strawberry and dark berries to black tea and earthy minerality. Burgundy produces Pinot Noirs that are full of aromas and nuances. If we hop across the pond, we have Pinots from Willamette Valley in Oregon with similar cloud cover, climate, and soil composition as Burgundy. Oregon produces smooth and fruity wines that are slightly earthy and most definitely tasty, giving the region of Burgundy a run for its money. You can find all of these at Total Wine and More, where we have a huge selection of Pinot Noirs from Oregon to Burgundy, plus wines from every region in between. All that's left now is to reach up to our shelves and pluck one out for yourself.
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine and More for today's A Spirited Debate. You know, there's an important point here, too, because so many of these cases are filed initially by challengers in the District of Columbia. Those are the very judges who spent 3-4 years adjudicating all these January 6 cases, realizing who the people really were, lecturing them, and then boom, in one fell swoop on the first day. So I think the credibility of the administration is already quite low there. But you're so right, Jen. I get, just as a former DOJer, some of this anecdotally, the place is a friggin' disaster.
Trying cases is really, going to court is really a young person's game. It is not for 64-year-olds. It's really not. Harry, you've tried a bunch. You know what I mean.
It's so true. Edward Bennett Williams says the lawyer doesn't get tired of the fights. He gets tired of the road work. It's just, it's exhausting.
So I'm going to court several times a week. And the DOJ lawyers, I guess there's one exception, one of those new lawyers in the Civil Rights Division who defended the elections EO. He was terrible. They brought in some election denier from Florida, some guy, and I've never seen such poor advocacy. He refused to answer the judge's questions. He argued the premises, and Judge Kohler could tell he's a very patient judge. She became fed up with him. He could have made a much better argument. So you're seeing that phenomenon of the true believers coming in who are not able to, but then the regulars who are left behind, they're so overloaded. They can't keep up with the caseload, and you're seeing it in the briefs, you're seeing in the quality of the arguments. Again, I do not think democracy won the first round, 15 100-day rounds that will make up the Trump administration, but Trump didn't win. Trump didn't win. And part of the reason is we met flood the zone with rule of law, shock and awe. I don't think Jen likes that slogan too much, but we have overwhelmed the system in defending the Constitution and defending the laws. I think the judges I'm before appreciate it. The judges are working hard. They understand their role. If Donald Trump is going to break the law, their job is to enforce the Constitution and laws of the United States. So I think the system can withstand it. The part that's breaking is Donald Trump, Stephen Miller, Susie Wiles, and their corrupt cohort of cronies.
But this is why, if I can just sort of tie this back to me, one of the more ominous things that happened this week. I mean, this is why, Norm, to me, the attacks on law firms are such a big deal, because not everyone is Norm Eisen, unfortunately.
Fortunately.
But listen, I mean, the law firms that bent the knee had all made these grandiose sort of statements about how the requirement that they do $100 million of pro bono work or X amount wouldn't actually require them to do anything they weren't already doing. Well, lo and behold, this week, the Trump administration dropped an executive order that says, actually, one of the things you'll be doing with all this pro bono time is defending cops when they're sued for excessive force or for other constitutional violations. And so, Harry, one thing I wonder about is how much the administration is going to use the hollowing out of the Justice Department as an excuse to basically co-opt all of these law firms into doing the government's litigation work for free. I mean, there are statutes that make that complicated, but I'm sure they've, have some inkling of how to do this. It's yet further reason why it's important for folks to sort of band together on this, because as the capacity of the executive branch to do bad things shrinks, no one should be putting themselves in a position where they can provide excess capacity.
David Kendall wrote a great piece in the Washington Post recently where he said, this is headed for a complete train wreck. There's no meeting of the minds on these deals. The law firms tell their associates in the world they've agreed to one set of things. Trump says something else. They go into court and they say a third thing. They have all of these mushy terms that are undefined. So what does happen when they go to Skadden and they say, defend the coal companies, defend the Venezuelan, government, or the El Salvadoran government? And they say, no way, we're not going to do that, or we can't, or no one will do it, we've asked, or we can't possibly do it because we have a fundamental conflict with a zillion other clients. What happens then? Well, I guess they're back in the doghouse, which just shows you can never appease these people because they always come back for more, and eventually you cannot give them what they want.
But the other thing that's very interesting, if you look at the alignment of the firms that bent the knee, kissed the ring, crawled on their belly to lick the boots, and you look at the firms, there's roughly 10 of them, and you look at the roughly 10 firms.
Groveled and crawled in the dirt. Sorry, go ahead.
Is that not enough? It's like the four names of James Brown. I have the four names of Obesians, law firm Obesians. But then you look on the other side of the agenda, the most feared litigating firms are on the other side when it comes to fighting high-profile cases. Civil cases, Sussman Godfrey, Quinn Emanuel, they are the two best civil trial firms in the country. Criminal, you had Abby Lowell, one of our most feared criminal litigators, with a bunch of Skadden exiles and others, started his own law firm this week. Williams and Connolly is on that side of the agenda. Smaller elite litigation boutiques like Kecker are there. And then the firms themselves that are refusing to bow down. Covington, Wilmer, Sussman, who I already mentioned. So it's not clear to me that in the end of the day, like so much else over the first 100 days, Trump got some traction, but did he really win? Did he really break the legal profession, or did he radicalize these corporate litigation firms that are now fighting him? And I'll say, since I have all these dozens of cases, there has been no diminution in the amount of pro bono and low bono energy and support. It's shifted around a little bit. There's still big firms that help. There's a lot of medium-sized individual firms. There's no shortage of helpers.
I want to go back to DOJ for a moment, but if I can tout you, Norm, it's not simply your litigation chops, but your organizing chops that have really been at the service of democracy, so kudos to you. But I want to return just to make a couple points. So will firms have to defend cops? But you know what's not going to be happening? We now know Harmon Dillon has bragged that they've disassembled the entire section of civil rights that actually comes in against. Now, it's always been an article of faith when you were in the Department of Justice. 99% of cops, they're good, they're important, you support them. But the bad cops, the damage they do within communities, that's institutionally now been closed down. That's the first point. Second point I want to make is, man, oh man, anyone I knew in the department would have rather ritually disemboweled themselves than stand before a federal judge. Well, I don't know. They didn't tell. I mean, it is so humiliating. And then finally, I just want to say about this point, a little bit of discussion, disagreement even, can the courts hold? It's so true that the courts were not designed for this. I agree with you, Jen, that they'll be, lifting as much as they can. What I wonder, and this would be a really important day, will one of these courts one day soon say, this is not an emergency, and literally shut down the whole cottage industry? Maybe you have a point, but it's not a friggin' emergency, and we're not going to jump and say how high every time you do the E word.
At the risk of dragging Congress back into this conversation.
Oh, no.
But some of the fault here really does lie with Congress. I mean, Congress, has delegated a remarkable amount of power to presidents of both parties in context in which Congress has included as part of the delegation the power to decide whether it even is an emergency, triggering those powers in the first place. And Harry, I mean, some of us have been writing about this for, it feels like forever, but for a long time. And so the problem is that when I think about sort of where are the courts in the best position to push back against Trump and where are they in the worst position, I think part of why many of us gravitate toward these due process issues in the removal cases is because that's just the bread and butter of what courts do. That is law. I mean, that's pure rule of law stuff. But when the question is, did this statute passed in 1977 give the president the power to decide that this particular type of economic sanction or tariff is actually within the interest? I mean, I'm much warier that this Supreme Court especially is going to want to sort of forge a new trail there, which is why I think we're seeing, at least to some extent, a bit of a split in how these cases are sorting.
Fair enough. Okay, contrarians, I wanted very much to sort of position this episode as a kind of pivot point because we're coming off of a very properly retrospective week. And I thought I wanted to just serve it up to make some forward-looking comment of any kind that you like. It could be sanguine, it could be pessimistic, but looking ahead to the second round, Norm, of the 15. What do you want to tell us?
Well, I think that Trump's obvious frustration, including, by the way, Trump and Musk, they sometimes lash out at me because I'm a frequent foil of theirs, and therefore I'm a frequent target of their rhetorical ire. I take it as a backhanded compliment. I think that the extreme frustration that they've encountered has led them to consider now a vicious cycle that is going to bounce back on them, like with the prosecution of this judge. That is not going to hold up. And so you see already an accelerated desperation. Judge Hannah Dugan, being the judge in Wisconsin I'm talking about. And I'm looking for Trump to, in the next 100 days, to sink even lower in the 30s. As Musk exits, that's not an accident. He's driven out by losing. And it was all the court losses and the coup de grace. I'm very proud. I filed the first lawsuit against him and Doge. I was the first to get him barred from Treasury, kicked out of Treasury. I have a case. I've gotten discovery in multiple of these cases. I'm proud of our role. I think you're going to see Trump's numbers start to sink down to the mid and low 30s over the next 100 days. And that is the point at which he becomes a gigantic albatross around his party. And you're looking at historic midterm landslide turf, starting with New Jersey and Virginia this year.
Will that affect Congress's lockstep with them as you see it?
Yes, I think it will. You're going to start to see, that Lieberman move when he broke with, they're in a cult, but they're not willing to be a part of the Jonestown. They have had the Kool-Aid, but not the poison Kool-Aid. So they're not going to immolate themselves on the altar of Donald Trump. And you're already seeing it, Harry. No sooner did he hit or breach 40% than you have Republicans in the House on the record saying, we're not going for all these Doge cuts. It's on the record. They're breaking with him. You're seeing votes against the tariffs. It's starting to falter. And I know I'm going on too long, but the theory of democracy that informs some of our work at the Contrarian is, first, you start with it's the 4 Ps. You start with the court proceedings. That was what emboldened the coalition. We won in court. And then the sparks jumped over. Soon you started seeing mass popular public protests, the second P. Third P, at and in the polls, election polls like in Wisconsin, landslide, Supreme Court race, but also public interest or public opinion polling. Fourth P is political leadership. That table full of Schumer and Jeffries lawyers in court with me, that is all clicking. All the 4P pistons of the democracy engine are all clicking now. It's going to accelerate in the second round, not to Donald Trump's benefit.
We forget the only thing that gets Trump from 39% to 30% are non-legal issues, is the economy. And he fucked up royally by actually going through with the tariffs. That, among all of the things he could easily have jettisoned, he could have done nothing for the last 100 days and let the economy percolate along. Instead, he has thrown it into utter chaos. That's just not Jennifer Rubin. That's businesses. That's investors. That's the markets. And he has created havoc. And we are now going from a trajectory where we had made that soft landing to a preponderance of the economists, the forecasters saying we're going to be in recession. That is his biggest problem. It's the biggest problem for Republicans. It's the biggest problem for him politically. And because of that, it will loosen people on some of these other issues. They might not want to break with him on Signalgate, but now that they bring up the fact that, oh, you're going to have to go back home and explain why you have $880 billion in Medicaid cuts, they get a little nervous and they look at his poll numbers and they say, okay, that stinks. And not only do his poll numbers stink, but these policies stink. And we have had a zero productivity from this Congress. Not only are they not present in the constitutional arena, they've done nothing. They haven't passed a single thing of any import. They barely kept the government from collapsing or shutting down. It was only because Chuck Schumer had, a brain freeze that week. He's gotten better since then. But they haven't done anything. And the economy is going south. This is what people who do not, with all deference to all of us and our friends, sit around thinking nonstop about due process and the rule of law, what concerns them. And I think the worst mistake he made was going through with the tariffs. And this is because he's an oppositional 2-year-old. Everyone tells him it's the wrong thing, so he's got to do it. And he's still stuck in 1980. Tariffs weren't going to solve the problem in the 1980s either. But he, I think, has finally, and he always is his worst enemy, but this, more than anything else, I think is going to sap what's left of this year and perhaps the presidency. It doesn't give me great joy because recession is not a good thing. We don't want recessions. People get hurt. This is bad for people. But he has brought it on him, and it will be up to Democrats to make sure voters understand it's him and those do-nothings in Congress who could have taken this power back and didn't. So they're all responsible for this. And that's the connection that Democrats are making, along with this very effective populist argument, which is cutting $880 billion of Medicaid, cutting the SNAP, cutting the Department of Education. What? To give Elon Musk more tax cuts? And that's now the focus, I think, increasingly of the American people and of Congress, because they're going to have to make some hard choices.
The famous Do Nothing Congress, which was a Harry Truman campaign ploy, passed 906 bills in 2 years. This Congress in 4 months has passed 5. And not only has it only passed 5, 3 of those are resolutions disapproving Biden-era regulations. So actually, it's passed 2 actual statutes in 4 months. But I will say, I'm not sure I really want this Congress passing that many more laws, but I do think that Jen is right. One of the most quotable things Bill Clinton ever said, right? It's the economy, stupid. And the question I have is just whether the havoc Trump is wrecking in that space might actually embolden the more conservative justices on the court into standing up more aggressively. And I'll just say, we're going to have some data points on that soon. I mean, there are so many significant pending issues in the Supreme Court right now. I think we'll know more about that sooner rather than later.
But I have to say, Steve, I saw such a striking statistic this week, the number of executive orders that Trump has issued, which is so much greater than FDR. And that has sucked up the legislative energy from Article 1 into Article 2. And do you know what that's a violation of? Something we're all familiar with, the United States Constitution. Trump has arrogated so much authority into Article 2. We have actually filed a holistic case this week where we said it's not just the individual illegal acts that have led to all these dozens of things. He's supplanted himself for the authority that the framers and the founders and Congress have delegated to the cabinet agencies. For example, with personnel firings and RIF, reduction in force. He doesn't have that power. But the theory of this case is exactly this, that he has sucked the energy that is supposed to be in Article 1 so they don't bother legislating.
All right, we are, sad to say, out of time. Thank you, Contrarians one and all, Norm, Jen, and Steve. We have just 45 seconds left to reassert Talking Feds custom at the end of this episode, which is we take a question and each of us has to answer in 5 words or fewer. And the question today, I think most people are familiar with Trump's comment, the $2 comment, as it'll go down in history. Well, maybe the children will have to have $2 instead of $30. And maybe the $2 will cost a couple bucks more than they would normally. So the question is, what is the next belt-tightening measure that the American people will need to endure because of the Trump tariffs?
Buy fewer Trump sneakers.
There you go.
Entitlement cuts qua budget reform.
Excellent.
Can't afford dozen eggs, just 2.
I'm going to the Rock Hudson Doris Day era. Return of the party line. Thank you so much, Norm, Jen, and Steve. And thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts. And please take a moment to rate and review this show. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. Check us out on Substack now, at Talking Feds Substack, where I am posting 2 or 3 bulletins a week, going live and sharing other exclusive content that breaks down the various threats to constitutional norms and the rule of law. You can follow us on Twitter at Talking Feds Pod. Talking Feds remains a completely independent production, so it's your support and nothing else that funds all of our franchises. We just couldn't do it without you. And as you may know, Talking Feds has now joined forces with the Contrarian. I'm a founding contributor to this new media venture, which is committed to reviving the diversity of opinion that feels increasingly rare in today's news landscape, where legacy media seems to be tacking toward Trump for business reasons rather than editorial ones. Rest assured, we are still the same scrappy independent podcast you've come to know and trust, but now linked up with an ambitious and vital project designed for this pivotal moment in our nation's legal and political discourses. Find out more at contrarian.substack.com. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine. Our associate producer is Becca Havian. Sound engineering by Matt McCardle. Rosie Dawn Griffin, David Lieberman, Hamza Mahadrenathan, Emma Maynard, and Hallie Necker are our contributing writers, and production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu and Sebastian Navarro. Our music, as ever, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.